Hello everyone, Zak Lyon here. You know this channel as a nutrition channel, and it is, but I'm adding a new element to it, and that element is book reviews. I read a lot of books, and a theme I've picked up on is throughout reading all these books is that if you want to get the most out of something like this, you need to summarize it in your own words. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. So this is a bit of a selfish exercise for myself, but I'm also hoping that it helps other people find good books. I hope it inspires other people with some of the information I present, and I hope it inspires people to improve themselves by picking up a new book, or a book I'm talking about, or a book that it inspires them or makes them think about. And so that's the kind of twofold nature of these videos. The book I'm starting with is I thought very hard and deeply about which book to start with. I didn't want it to be a nutrition book. I didn't want it to be a history book. I wanted it to be a book that everyone could benefit from. Everyone could learn something from. And something that has been huge in my life, very impactful, was this book. And it's funny because I didn't think I wanted to read it. I thought I was past the point in my life where I needed to read this book. And, you know, I was just so wrong. This book is for everyone at every stage of life. But the reason I didn't think I wanted to read it was because it is a book that gets talked a lot about as a survivor literature book, because this man was thrown in a concentration camp in 1941 or something like that, and he spent 3 or 4 years there. And they sound like very long years. I had read about the Second World War and about the concentration camps. I understood the experiments that went on there, and I thought, I'm good. I've read that. I've heard all the atrocious things that went on. The hypothermia experience, the vivisections, the cutting out of nerves, like, that would just be excruciating and unbearable. I'd read about all that. It was terrifying. It made me depressed, and I read a lot about. I read a lot of these things back in middle school, which I just was not prepared emotionally to read. I was blown away by the terribleness of people, and it made me sad. And so I didn't think I needed to read this again. I thought, I got it. It's going to be a story about a man who's going through a concentration camp, all the terrible things that happened to him, and how you just got to remain positive and find the value in suffering, and find the virtue in suffering. And I was like, I don't want to suffer. There is no value in suffering, and whatever. So I didn't want to read it, but it's a short book, and I was like, you know what? My dad's recommended this forever. It's a classic, a modern classic. It is, so I should read it. So I did. And I was blown away by how much I liked it. The first part is all about his experience in the concentration camp, which I was familiar with from other sources. My favorite part of the book was the second part. The second part is about logotherapy that Viktor Frankl used before the war and used after the war to help people find meaning in their life and to help people thrive. He contrasted it against Sigmund Freud's psychotherapy. I knew a lot about Sigmund Freud and a lot about psychotherapy, and I thought it was great. I thought, oh man, it's so cool. The ego, the id, the superego. It's so cool. There's these little components of the brain that one does one job, the other does another job, and another does another job, and they all conflict, but they work together. And some are, reign dominion over others, and then you've got to find a way to and I realized after reading this book, thank goodness I read it, it's that psychotherapy, it's retrospective and way too introspective, and it just begs the individual to remain with their bad habits, or their bad mindset, or their bad psychology, because it just asks them to live it and relive it and think harder about it and learn more about it. And it just keeps at it instead of going, where do you want to get to? Well, let's spend our time doing that. It's so retrospective and just problem oriented, not solution oriented. So I loved this book because of the logotherapy of the second part. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the foreword, and then I'm going to skip the first part. But if you haven't read about people's experience in concentration camps, it's a good read. You should read it. So the foreword, written by someone else, I think. Yeah, written by Harold. I'm going to read this little bit. Finally, Frankl's most enduring insight, one that I have called on often in my own life and in countless counseling sessions. Forces beyond our control can take away everything you possess except one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in life, but you can always control what you feel and what you do about what happens to you. And this was a lesson my father taught me from day one. I don't care what the other kids are doing or what someone else did or said to you. I only care about how you responded, how you reacted to it. Because you always have a choice, and the picture that comes to my mind about that is when someone does something to you that makes you feel, let's say, angry. There's a millisecond or half a millisecond where you've got the choice to let it make you angry or to not let it make you angry, and you have to take that millisecond and make it 5 milliseconds. And take that 5 milliseconds and make it 100 milliseconds. And we're not even at a second yet. It is that quickly that it happens. But there is that moment between there where you can go cause, and I get to choose the effect. That cause is going to make me feel angry, or that cause is going to make me go, whatever, man. Just no, not getting angry. And you have to stretch out and develop and strengthen that millisecond into something longer. So you've got time to go, no, I'm not even going there. Whatever. Instead of just, cause, okay, now I'm pissed. Now I'm pissed forever. I'm pissed for the rest of the day. My whole day's ruined. There's no going back. You gotta get out of that. And that's, for someone who's in a concentration camp, who's being barked at by the guards, who's being experimented on, who's being walked out in the freezing snow with no shoes, with no jacket, with barely slacks. You're freezing. You have to find a way just to not get angry. And I don't understand how. I don't ever want to, but this is what he wrote the book about. So this next part. Trying to figure out where to start. This paragraph starts, and so it is both strange and remarkable to me that among some dozens of books I have authored, precisely this one, which I have intended to be published anonymously so that it could never build up any reputation on the part of the author, did become a success. Again and again, I therefore admonished my students both in Europe and America, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as a byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. So what he's talking about is your work or loving somebody. He continues, happiness must happen. And the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. I want you to listen to what your conscience commands you to do and go on to carry it out to the best of your knowledge. Then you will live to see that in the long run, I say, success will follow you precisely because you had forgotten to think of it. This is the old point of do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. It's what he's saying here is spend your time on what drives you, because that's what you're going to be good at. That's what is going to get you out of bed in the morning. That's what you're going to enjoy doing. You're going to spend your time doing it. You're not going to wait till 5 o'clock until you're off the clock. And that will lead to success. That's exactly what he's saying. And then that's the end of the preface written by him. And then part one starts. I'm going to skip part one because for me it's not as important as the second part. And this is just for me. You should certainly read it. If you haven't read any, let's say, survivor literature from these concentration camps, and it really does inform and kind of validate his the second part. And as I read here in the preface, he says he wanted to publish this anonymously, and I think one of the reasons he wanted to was so he wasn't making a spectacle of himself. So people were like, "Oh my God, that's why I'm paying attention to you." He wanted the theory to stand on its own. He didn't want to be the man who survived the camp. He wanted the theory, the logotherapy to shine, not his ability to execute logotherapy and remain positive. So, and I commend him for that. So the second part starts and is titled Logotherapy in a Nutshell. And what he kind of says is, look, I've written dozens of manuscripts, hundreds of manuscripts, papers and whatnot about this. And so he's saying, look, I'm going to try and condense all this into the next 100 pages, and these pages are short. And he's saying, I'm going to try, but I mean, this stuff is complicated. There's a lot to it, but I'm going to simplify it for you. So this the first section in this second part of the book is titled "The Will to Meaning," and he says, "Man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life, and not a secondary rationalization of instinctual drives." And what he's saying here is he's kind of contradicting Freud and Adler. Freud would say, it's right here. That is why I speak of a will to meaning in contrast to the pleasure principle, or as we could also term it, the will to pleasure, on which Freudian psychoanalysis is centered, as well as in contrast to the will to power, on which Adlerian psychology, using the term striving for superiority, is focused. And I like this. I wish I had learned more about Viktor Frankl in my psychology classes. I got my undergraduate, I double majored. One of my undergraduate degrees was in psychology, and I didn't learn anything about Viktor Frankl. And I love this stuff 10 times more than I like Freud. And I thought I liked Freud for years, for a decade. The last decade, I thought, oh, Freud's awesome. His ego, the id, the superego, that's so cool, man. No, it's so introspective, and it's just so, I just don't love it anymore after reading this book. So this next bit here, he defines a few terms: existential frustration, neurogenic neuroses. This existential frustration is just may be used in three ways to refer to: 1, existence itself, i.e. the specifically human mode of being; 2, the meaning of existence; and 3, the striving to find a concrete meaning in personal existence. That is to say, the will to meaning. Neurogenic neuroses is the next section. Neurogenic neuroses do not emerge from conflicts between drives and instincts, but rather from existential problems. So it's not that we don't feel powerful. It's not that our dad was an asshole and we're trying to make him proud and blah blah blah. It's existential problems that we deal with. This next section, within this section, I'm going to read a little bit. Any analysis, however, even when it refrains from including the neurological dimensions in this therapeutic process, tries to make the patient aware of what he actually longs for in the depth of his being. Logotherapy deviates from psychoanalysis, Freud, insofar as it considers man a being whose main concern consists in fulfilling a meaning rather than in the mere gratification and satisfaction of drives and instincts, or in merely reconciling the conflicting claims of id, ego, and superego, or in the mere adaptation and adjustment to society and environment. So he's just saying psychotherapy's got it wrong, and that man is really searching for meaning in everything he does. Not he's trying to fulfill his need to be superior to other men, or his need to be a sexual tyrannosaurus, It's the meaning. It's the meaning in people's lives. This next section, nuodynamics. To be sure, man's search for meaning may arouse inner tension rather than inner equilibrium. However, precisely such tension is an indispensable prerequisite of mental health. I'm going to keep going, but there is nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life. There is much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he's a philosopher. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. I can see in these words a motto which holds true for any psychotherapy. In the Nazi concentration camps, one could have witnessed that those who knew that there was a task waiting for them to fulfill were most apt to survive. The same conclusion has since been reached by other authors of books on concentration camps, and also by psychiatric investigations into Japanese, North Korean, and North Vietnamese prisoner of war camps. One of the parts of section 1 that's good here, that he's talking about here, is that what he noticed was it wasn't the physically strongest people that survived the concentration camp. It was the people who had a reason to keep going. And this is the human element. This is the thing that we are still trying to quantify. And this is what moves humans. And this is what he's saying is the most important thing to pay attention to in your normal everyday life. Is the meaning of what keeps you moving, not anything else. And what he saw was the people who had a reason to survive, him being that he had this logotherapy that all his manuscripts were taken from him when he entered the concentration camp. And he was like, oh my God, this is my life's work. And his meaning was to make sure this got back out to people. And I'm sure he had other ones too, but what he saw was other people who had meaning were the ones that survived. And what he's saying here is he's not the only one to have seen this. Thus, I'm going to skip down. Thus, it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension. The tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. So what he's saying here is, if you're seeking a life of zero mental tension, you're not trying hard enough to become something. If you're so satisfied where you are, I guess great, whatever. I'm not sure what he'd have to say about that. He'd probably say, are you sure? If there's nothing else you want to get, and then you go, oh, I guess there are. And then the tension comes in where you go, oh, I'm not there yet. Do I have what it takes? Am I able to? Do I have the resources needed for it? And that's the tension that he's saying is necessary for humans. It's what it just is. Such a tension is inherent in the human being and therefore is indispensable to mental well-being. We should not then be hesitant about challenging man with a potential meaning for him to fulfill. It is only thus that we can evoke his will to meaning from its state of latency. I consider it a dangerous misconception of mental hygiene to assume that what man needs in the first place is equilibrium, or as it is called in biology, homeostasis, i.e. a tensionless state. What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. What he needs is not the discharge of tension at any cost, but the call of a potential meaning waiting for him to be fulfilled, waiting to be fulfilled by him. And right here, he's just drilling into Freud, going, what he needs is not the discharge of tension at any cost. Freud would say people, try to discharge their tension by, being, Freud was all about sex. Everything was sex to Freud. And human beings, everything is about sex for humans, largely. That's true. But what he's saying here is that it's the call of a potential meaning waiting to be fulfilled by him. That's the need. What man needs is not homeostasis, but what I call nuodynamics, i.e. the existential dynamics in a polar field of tension, where one pole is represented by a meaning that is to be fulfilled, and the other pole by the man who has to fulfill it. And one should not think that it holds true only for normal conditions. In neurotic individuals, it is even more valid. If architects want to strengthen a decrepit ark, they increase the load which is laid upon it, for thereby the parts are joined more firmly together. And I love that analogy. I'm not an architect, so I can't swear to it, but it makes sense. The ark, if it's decrepit, you increase the load on it, so it like pushes each other in the right direction or whatever. And he's saying that for humans, you don't unload and get rid of responsibilities. You take them seriously, and you act on them, and you try and achieve them, and all that. So if therapists wish to foster their patients' mental health, they should not be afraid to create a sound amount of tension through a reorientation toward the meaning of one's life. Brilliant. Having shown the beneficial impact of meaning orientation, I turn to the detrimental influence of that feeling of which so many patients complain today, namely the feeling of a total and ultimate meaninglessness of their lives. They lack the awareness of a meaning worth living for. They are haunted by the experience of their inner emptiness, a void within themselves. They are caught in that situation which I have called the existential vacuum. And I just find this funny because this is just as true now as when he wrote it, which was, the 40s, 1940, 1959, I don't know. The point is, this is a human condition, this existential vacuum, so if you're experiencing it, don't be alarmed, Such security, like paradise, is closed to man forever. Man has to make choices. In addition to this, however, man has suffered another loss in his more recent development, inasmuch as the traditions which buttressed his behavior are now rapidly diminishing. No instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism. He either wishes to do what other people do, or what other people wish him to do. The existential vacuum manifests itself mainly in a state of boredom. Now we can understand Schopenhauer when he said that mankind was apparently doomed to vacillate eternally between two extremes of distress and boredom. Let us consider, for instance, Sunday neuroses, that kind of depression which afflicts people who become aware of the lack of content in their lives when the rush of the busy week is over and the void within themselves become manifest. Not a few cases of suicide can be traced back to this existential vacuum. Such widespread phenomena as depression, aggression, and addiction are not understandable unless we recognize the existential vacuum underlying them. An analogous event occurs in neurotic cases. There are certain types of feedback mechanisms and vicious circle formations which I will touch upon later. One can observe again and again, however, that this symptomology has invaded an existential vacuum, wherein it then continues to flourish. I wrote a note here that said Freud, but I'm not sure why. For by filling the existential vacuum, the patient will be prevented from suffering further relapses. And I think this is the point here of You don't, who cares why you're experiencing an existential vacuum? It's a human condition, you could say. That's why. Okay, so now move on to the filling the void. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying fill the void. Don't spend your time going, well, there's like 3 million reasons why the void exists. And let's go one by one and see if this resonates with you. And then you find one that goes, oh yeah, that's why. Okay, great. Now what are you going to fill it with? The answer of why doesn't matter. The answer of how are you going to fill it is the one that matters. The meaning of life. To put the question in general terms would be comparable to the question posed to a chess champion. Tell me, master, what is the best move in the world? There simply is no such thing as the best or even a good move apart from a particular situation in a game and the particular personality of one's opponent. The same holds for human existence. One should not search for an abstract meaning of life. Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life to carry out a concrete assignment which demands fulfillment. Therein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is unique, as is his specific opportunity to implement it. So, there is no single answer to the meaning of life. You have to spend time on yourself. You have to work on what your meaning in life is. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. So he has to answer rather than ask the question. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life. He can only respond by being responsible. Thus, logotherapy sees in responsibleness the very essence of the human existence. And I forgot, before I mention that, I wrote here the Protestant work ethic. The Protestants said that the interpretation of Scripture should be left to the individual. And I've spoken with my dad a lot about this point, and it's just the responsibleness of the individual. You have to come up with the answers for yourself. You know yourself better than anyone else, better than the Scriptures. You have to interpret them for yourself. You can't let someone else tell you their interpretation of the Scripture and how it's right for you. They can perhaps help you interpret it for yourself, but you cannot take someone's word for it. You have to go and evaluate it for yourself. And that's what he's saying here. That is why a logotherapist is the least tempted of all psychotherapists to impose value judgments on his patients, for he will never permit the patient to pass to the doctor the responsibility of judging. It's brilliant. It puts on the responsibility to the individual, not to the doctor. Doctor, tell me what's wrong with me. Well, let's talk about it, but you tell me where you want to go and your plan, and I'll help you formulate it and whatever, but you have to come up with it. It is therefore up to the patient to decide whether he should interpret his life task as being responsible to society or to his own conscience. There are people, however, who do not interpret their own lives merely in terms of a task assigned to them, but also in terms of the taskmaster who assigned it to them. So I think earlier in this book he said that on the east coast of the United States we have the Statue of Liberty, right? That's what this country was founded on, liberty. The ability to choose for yourself your religion, your political leanings, your how to raise your kids, how to whatever. And what he says is we need to build a statue of responsibleness on the West Coast. So that on the East Coast we say liberty. It's man needs liberty to make his own decisions. And on the West Coast we say man has a responsibility to do something with that liberty. You can't just throw liberty at someone and that's it. They have to feel responsible to do something with it. So by declaring that man is responsible and must actualize the potential meaning of his life, I wish to stress that the true meaning of life is to be discovered in the world rather than within man or in his own psyche, as though it were a closed system. And right again, he's just drilling into Freud, going, don't be so introspective. Boop, bitty, boop. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit. This next section, the meaning of suffering. Okay. Edith Weisskopf-Joelson, before her death, professor of psychology at the University of Georgia, contended in her article on logotherapy that our current mental hygiene philosophy stresses the idea that people ought to be happy, that unhappiness is a symptom of maladjustment. Such a value system might be responsible for the fact that the burden of unavoidable unhappiness is increased by unhappiness about being unhappy. Brilliant. I love this. And in another paper, she expressed the hope that logotherapy may help counteract certain unhealthy trends in the present-day culture of the United States, where the incurable sufferer is given very little opportunity to be proud of his suffering and to consider it ennobling rather than degrading, so that he is not only unhappy, but he is also ashamed of being unhappy. I've been there, and it is so stupid, where you're unhappy, and then instead of just living normally, unhappy, you live ashamed, or you live sad, depressed, that you're unhappy. And it's not redundant. Those are two different things, and it just makes it all so much worse, especially when you're interacting with people. Instead of the many pages of my manuscript, I found in a pocket of the newly acquired coat one single page torn out of a Hebrew prayer book containing the most important Jewish prayer. So in the concentration camps, they shared clothes where someone would be sent to the gas chambers, and you get that guy's clothes. So instead of the many pages of my manuscript, which he lost when he was put in a concentration camp, they were taken from him, I found in a pocket of the newly acquired coat one single page torn out of a Hebrew prayer book containing the most important Jewish prayer, Shema Yisrael. I hope I'm saying that right. How should I have interpreted such a coincidence other than as a challenge to live my thoughts instead of merely putting them on paper? So, he had to live this whole theory, unfortunately. After a while, I proceeded to another question, this time addressing myself to the whole group. The question was whether an ape which was being used to develop a polio serum, and for the reason punctured again and again, would ever be able to grasp the meaning of its suffering. And this is so sad because we experiment on animals, and honestly, most of it's bullshit, like the cosmetics, but some of it saves human lives. And it's sad, and I hope we find better solutions to it. But what he's saying here is, does that ape, it's probably not a gorilla, understand the meaning of its suffering? No, it doesn't. Unanimously, the group replied that of course it would not. With its limited intelligence, it could not enter into the world of man, i.e. the only world in which the meaning of its suffering would be understandable. Then I pushed forward with the following question: and what about man? Are you sure that the human world is a terminal point in the evolution of the cosmos? Is it not conceivable but that there is still another dimension, a world beyond man's world, a world in which the question of an ultimate meaning of human suffering would find an answer? It's an interesting question. I observe that procreation is not the only meaning of life, for then life in itself would become meaningless, and something which it itself is meaningless cannot be rendered meaningful merely by its perpetuation. I love this, because this goes against the Darwin theory of, we exist to procreate, and that's the purpose of genes are to replicate itself. That is so mechanistic, mechanical. I don't like it, and apparently neither does Viktor Frankl, and I love this part. So he says, however, the rabbi evaluated his plight as an Orthodox Jew in terms of despair that there was no son of his own who would ever say the Kaddish for him after his death. but I would not give up. I made a last. So he's telling a story here about a rabbi who lost his entire family, and he's depressed. Oh God, what was it? He had lost his first wife and their 6 children in the concentration camp of Auschwitz as they were gassed. And now it turns out that his second wife was sterile. Okay, so this rabbi was depressed that he would never have another son. But I would not give up. I made a last attempt to help him by inquiring whether he did not hope to see his children again in heaven. However, my question was followed by an outburst of tears. And now the true reason of his despair came to the fore. He explained that his children, since they died as innocent martyrs, were thus found worthy of the highest place in heaven. But as for himself, he could not expect, as an old sinful man, to be assigned to the same place. He did not give up, but was retorted. It is not conceivable, Rabbi, that precisely this was the meaning of your surviving your children, that you may be purified through these years of suffering, so that finally you too, though not innocent like your children, may become worthy of joining them in heaven? Is it not written in the Psalms that God preserves all your tears? So perhaps none of your sufferings were in vain. For the first time in many years, he found relief from his suffering through the new point of view through which I was able to open him up to. Life's transitoriness. Oh my gosh, there's so many more notes here. Those things which seem to take meaning away from human life include not only suffering but dying as well. I never tire of saying that the only really transitory aspects of life are the potentialities. But as soon as they are actualized, they are rendered realities at that very moment. They are saved and delivered into the past, wherein they are rescued and preserved from transitoriness. For in the past, nothing is irretrievably lost, but everything irrevocably stored. However, logotherapy has developed as a special technique to handle such cases too, to understand what is going on wherever this technique is used. We take as a starting point a condition which is frequently observed in neurotic individuals, namely anticipatory anxiety. It is characteristic of this fear that it produces precisely that of which the patient is afraid. An individual, for example, who is afraid of blushing when he enters a large room and faces many people will actually become more prone to blush under these circumstances. In this context, one might amend the saying, the wish is father to the thought, to the fear is mother to the event. Ironically enough, in the same way that fear brings to pass what one is afraid of, likewise a forced intention makes impossible what one forcibly wishes. This excessive intention, or hyperintention as I call it, can be observed particularly in cases of sexual neuroses. The more a man tries to demonstrate his sexual potency to a woman, or a woman her ability to experience orgasm, the less they are able to succeed. This might be a little dated, this ability for a woman to experience orgasm, but that's what he's written here. Pleasure is and must remain a side effect or byproduct, and is destroyed and spoiled to a degree to which it is made a goal in itself. In addition to excessive intention, as described above, excessive attention or hyperreflection, as it is called in logotherapy, may also be pathogenic, that is, lead to sickness. The following clinical report will indicate what I mean. A young woman came to me complaining of being frigid. The case history showed that in her childhood she had been sexually abused by her father. However, it had not been this traumatic experience in itself which had eventuated in her sexual neuroses, or could be easily evinced, or as could easily be evinced. For it turned out that through reading popular psychoanalytic literature, the patient had lived constantly with the fearful expectation of the toll which her traumatic experience would someday take. This anticipatory anxiety resulted in both excessive intention to conform her femininity and excessive attention centered upon herself rather than upon her partner. This was enough to incapacitate the patient for the peak experience of sexual pleasure, since the orgasm was made an object of intention and an object of attention as well, instead of remaining an unintended effect of unreflected dedication and surrender to the partner. After undergoing short-term logotherapy, the patient's excessive attention and intention of her ability to experience orgasm had been de-reflected, to introduce another logotherapeutic term. When her attention was refocused toward the proper object, i.e. the partner or orgasm, orgasm established itself spontaneously. Logotherapy bases its technique called paradoxical intention on the twofold fact that fear brings about that which one is afraid of, and that hyperintention makes impossible what one wishes. In German, I described paradoxical intention as early as 1939. In this approach, the phobic patient is invited to attend, even if only for a moment, precisely that which he fears. I wrote here that I should read this whole page, but I'm gonna skip it. Oh, here we go. You know what? I'm not. I'm gonna keep going. Let me recall a case. A young physician consulted me because of his fear of perspiring. Whenever he expected an outbreak of perspiration, this anticipatory anxiety was enough to precipitate excessive sweating. In order to cut this circle formation, I advised the patient, and I love this here. I love this. I advised the patient, in the event that sweating should occur, to resolve deliberately to show people how much he could sweat. And this is supposed to be funny, but it's supposed to be the real therapy. A week later, he returned to report that whenever he met someone who triggered his anticipatory anxiety, he said to himself, I only sweated out a quart before, but now I'm going to pour out at least 10 quarts. The result was that after suffering from this phobia for 4 years, he was able, after a single session, to free himself permanently of it within 1 week. So what he did was, okay, you're scared of sweating too much. When you're talking to someone and you start feeling too scared and you think you're going to start sweating, go, I'm going to sweat so fucking much, it's going to be ridiculous. And it's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to bring up the ridiculousness, the ludicrous nature of knowing you fear something and then letting the anticipation of it cause what you fear. It's supposed to bring that silliness to light. The reader will note that this procedure consists of a reversal of the patient's attitude, inasmuch as his fear is replaced by a paradoxical wish. By this treatment, the wind is taken out of the sails of the wind is taken out of the sails of the anxiety. It's brilliant. It's simple, and after one session, if someone really commits to it, apparently they can get rid of a phobia. Such a procedure, and this reminds me of Tony Robbins, I think, this idea. Such a procedure, however, must make use of the specifically human capacity for self-detachment inherent in a sense of humor. The basic capacity to detach one from oneself is actualized whenever the logotherapeutic technique called paradoxical intention is applied. At the same time, the patient is enabled to put himself at a distance from his own neurosis. A statement consistent with this is found in Gordon W. Allport's book, The Individual and His Religion. The neurotic who learns to laugh at himself may be on his way to self-management, perhaps to cure. Paradoxical intention is the empirical validation and clinical application of Allport's statement. So what it's saying here is if you're anxious to talk to somebody, just to talk to them, when you start feeling anxious to talk to them, just in your head go, I'm going to be so awkward here and terrible at this conversation that they're going to hate me and it's going to go so poorly that my head, it's just going to blow up. It's going to be so bad. And you're supposed to laugh at yourself because you're supposed to go, why? I wouldn't say that consciously, so why do I let it happen unconsciously, subconsciously? A few more case reports may serve to clarify this method further. I think you get it, so I'm going to skip this, but it is a good example here. And the next few pages are actually really good, and they just keep going on this paradoxical intention. And it's brilliant. It's excellent. And again, there's just so many notes here, but this book review's going way longer than I thought. So the collective neuroses. As for psychotherapy, however, it will never be able to cope with this state of affairs on a mass scale if it does not keep itself free from the impact and influence of the contemporary trends of a nihilistic philosophy. Otherwise, it represents a symptom of the mass neuroses rather than its possible cure. Perfect. Such a view of man makes a neurotic believe what he is prone to believe anyway, namely that he is the pawn and victim of outer influence and inner circumstance. This is exactly what I was talking about, him talking about earlier. It's so introspective, and it just begs the individual to keep having this psychological problem. By that, a term, pandeterminism. By that I mean the view of man which disregards his capacity to take a stand toward any condition whatsoever. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the next moment. Love it. This is the story of Dr. J, the mass murderer of Steinhoff. How can we dare to predict what the behavior of man? How can we dare to predict the behavior of man? We may predict the movements of a machine, of an automaton, more than this. We may even try to predict the mechanisms or dynamics of the human psyche as well, but man is more than psyche. Freedom, however, is not the last word. Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. Freedom is but the negative aspect of the whole phenomenon, whose positive aspect is responsibleness. Oh, I guess this is the part of the book where he talks about this. In fact, freedom is a danger Freedom is in danger of degenerating into a mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. This is why I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented with a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. The psychiatric credo. Therefore, a residue of freedom, however limited it may be, is left to man in neurotic and even psychotic cases. A doctor, however, who would still implement his own role mainly as that of a technician, would confess that he sees in his patient nothing more than a machine, instead of seeing the human being as human being behind the disease. A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also the being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. That's the end of the book. The postscript that he wrote in 1984 has a bunch of good elements to it. But I'm not sure if I should get into it or not. I think I'm just going to let everyone take a look at the postscript that he wrote in 1984 on their own. It's good. I took a lot of notes during it. God, it's really good. It's great. It really is. But I'm going to skip it. That's it for now. I may come back later and do a kind of a book review on the postscript and the afterword that he wrote. But for now, I mean, this was one of my favorite books. I hope some of these excerpts from it led you to understand what the book is about and what logotherapy tries to help people do. And I loved it. Great book. I highly recommend it. Anyway, not sure what the next book will be, but it should be a good one.